They spend the entire week trying to close the sky with paperwork and bravado. They rotate shifts, change passwords, increase patrols, acting as if quantity can replace reach. A general demands reports every 2 hours and no one dares to say the truth. It's not a hole, it's a ceiling. It feels like standing in a dark hallway, hearing footsteps on the floor above. With every new envelope, the same humiliation. Perfect angles, surgical details, secrets extracted without a single shot fired. And then comes the worst kind of fear, the silent kind. Because when the enemy attacks, you react. When he watches, you unravel. One officer suggests planting bait, moving fake trucks, building empty hangars, staging old equipment to fool the lens. Another snaps back. What if they spot the performance? What if they laugh? The word laugh stings more than bomb. In closed meetings, a final solution begins to form. Bring down the ghost. But bringing down something you can't see is like firing into silence, hoping to hit a scream. Still, they reposition batteries, test new missiles, train fighters to climb to the limit. And for a few days, they believe they can regain control, until someone lets it slip, almost by accident. If it really is a U-2, one day it will fail, one day it will fall. The whole room holds its breath, because that wasn't a prediction. It was hope. On the dawn when everything changed, the radio wouldn't stop. A metallic voice repeated codes, sectors, altitudes. The target flew high, as always, confident as always, cutting across the country as if the Soviet sky were a private corridor. But this time something on the ground was different. Repositioned batteries, unblinking operators, and a missile that finally touched the ceiling that had seemed untouchable. When the blip appeared on the scope, no one celebrated. They'd learned that enthusiasm invites bad luck. Locked, the operator says, and the room turns to stone. Command approves. A distant flash, then another. For a few seconds, nothing happens, and fear swells. What if it escapes again? Then the report comes that makes even the hardest men swallow dry. Impact, parachute, pilot alive. Alive. That means proof. Interrogation. And for the first time, they can show the world they weren't hallucinating. That the enemy really had been strolling above everyone. But as they toast in silence, an aide opens a map and sees the cruel part. If an aircraft like that had passed so many times, how many photos did it carry away before it fell? And what if the scoot isn't the end, but the beginning of something far worse? When the pilot was brought in, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like an ordinary man, tired, with the face of someone who still can't believe he fell. And that made it more infuriating. Monsters justify fear. Ordinary men only prove the American advantage was technical, not mystical. They search the gear with almost childish urgency. Maps, codes, pills, a camera that seems like a vital organ of the aircraft. An officer holds the film canister as if it were dynamite. Here it is, he murmurs, what they know. And in that moment, the final paranoia is born. If one flight carries this many secrets, every flight before it carried more. The interrogation tries to pull routes, altitudes, frequencies. The pilot gives what he can, withholds what he must. But what truly knocks the room flat is what doesn't need to be said. They weren't photographing one specific thing. They were photographing everything. Roads, rail lines, depots, patterns. The war of the future wouldn't be decided only by tanks. It would be decided by who sees first. Outside, the leadership senses a chance to publicly humiliate Washington and prepares the reveal with a playwright's precision. Inside, technicians study what's left of the plane and reach a cruel conclusion. Even if you shoot one down, the idea doesn't die. And one question starts ticking like a clock. If they can already see from above, what happens when they start seeing from space? For a few weeks, the downed aircraft becomes an anesthetic. The press, the speeches, the symbolic victory. We caught the intruder. But behind closed doors, no one relaxes. It feels like shooting a thief at the window and still hearing footsteps in the kitchen. And then the envelopes return. New images, new angles, the same cruel clarity. Only now comes the detail that freezes the officers. There was no possible flight, no radar track, No report. No signal. And the photos lack the human flaw of an airplane. No shake, no route variation. They are regular, cold, mathematical. A scientist points to the sequence like he's pointing to a verdict. This doesn't pass, it orbits. The word orbits lands in the room like a gunshot with no sound. Someone tries to argue, not from logic, but from desperation. But satellites are few. They fail. They fall. The scientist answers with a sad smile. And when one falls, they launch another, and another, and another. In that instant, it's no longer about a base, a hangar, a missile. It's about the death of privacy as a concept. Any construction, any movement, any secret too large to fit in a basement can be seen. And if you're feeling this tension right now, do something quick. Hit like and tell me in the comments what your first thought would be if you discovered the enemy was watching you from above, and you couldn't even point a weapon at him. Because the Soviets' next step was even more desperate, and almost nobody talks about it. The Soviet reaction wasn't only military, it was almost psychological. If the Americans could see everything, then the only way out was to become a country that looked like nothing. A quiet fever begins. Hide, confuse, stage. One colonel orders trucks to drive in circles just to create false tracks. Another lines up rows of old vehicles as fake troops. Camouflage nets become national blankets. They build empty hangars with perfect doors, paint fake shadows on the ground, plant trees where there was concrete yesterday, as if a forest could grow overnight. One word guides it all: maskirovka, deception. And the most frightening part is that it isn't theater for soldiers. It's theater for a camera that never blinks. But every performance has a problem. It has to be maintained all the time. And maintaining it costs money, exhausts people, invites mistakes. A sergeant forgets a tarp. A crew leaves a mark in the soil. A truck takes the wrong turn. And up above, someone in Washington simply notes, changed. Paranoia enters the routine. Meetings happen at random hours. Convoys move before dawn. Bases are redesigned like labyrinths, because now the fear isn't an immediate attack. It's being understood. And when the enemy understands your pattern, he doesn't have to rush. He just waits. So tell me in the comments, do you really think you can hide something from the sky? Or is that a battle you lose the moment it begins? Because the Soviets' next decision was extreme. They tried to turn the sky into a battlefield, and it pushed the world closer to the edge than most people realize. When you can't hide, you deny. When denial fails, you try to bring it down. But how do you shoot down eyes that live in orbit? The Soviet answer is brutally simple. If you can't close the lens, close the politics. They begin pushing for rules, treaties, speeches about sovereignty. While under the table, they sprint to build better missiles, higher-reaching radars, faster interceptors. But the race carries poison. Every Soviet improvement confirms the fear. If you invest in climbing higher, it's because someone is already above you. And with every new American satellite, the question returns, what did they see this time? That feeling of always being behind is what drives a superpower mad. And that's when the world enters a period where everything becomes dangerously delicate. Any construction, any test, any movement of warheads can be seen and interpreted as preparation for a strike. The terror isn't the photo itself. It's the meaning someone chooses to attach to it. A badly translated report, a shadow mistaken for a missile, a freight train read as nuclear movement, and suddenly the decision machine starts turning. And what few people notice is that being watched also limits the watcher, because if the U.S. could see, the Soviets could also deduce where the U.S. was looking, what the U.S. feared, what it considered important. Espionage becomes a mirror. The game isn't only hiding, it's manipulating what the other side believes. And this is exactly where the most unsettling part begins. There were nights when one simple misreading of signals put the world minutes from catastrophe. If this has you hooked, subscribe now, because the next segment is the moment when seeing everything almost became destroying everything. On one of those nights, an officer on duty stared at a panel full of lights and thought it was the future. Machines that warn you before disaster. The early warning system existed for one simple, terrible purpose: to tell you if missiles were coming. And ironically, it was another way of seeing everything. But seeing everything isn't the same as understanding everything. A signal blinked where it shouldn't. Then another. And another. The screen said, "Launch." Not one. Several. For a few seconds, the world shrank to the size of a room with a red phone. The manual said to pass the information upward, fast, with conviction, as if conviction could stop an explosion. But the man on shift noticed a tiny detail, almost ridiculous. The story didn't feel real. There was no radar confirmation, no expected pattern. It looked too perfect. And in war, perfection can be a flaw. He swallowed hard and held the report for minutes that felt like hours, because he knew the real trigger wasn't the missile. It was panic. The kind of panic born when you believe the enemy sees everything, knows everything, and is always one step ahead. In the end, the alarm was false. But the question remained, burning. If a screen can lie, what happens when a decision has to be made before the truth arrives? After that scare, obsession turns into doctrine. It isn't enough to have missiles. You need certainty. And certainty in the Cold War was almost impossible. The Soviets invest in redundancy. More sensors, more layers, more people confirming everything. But each layer adds another problem. More failure points, more interpretations, more chances for someone to see what they want to see. Meanwhile, the Americans keep launching satellites, improving resolution, shortening the time between one photo and the next. Inside the Soviet bloc, it feels like being examined like an insect under a lens. One marshal, in a rare moment of candor, says the enemy doesn't even need to invade anymore. Just watch until it finds the weak spot. And that changes everything. Because when you believe your secret is already known, you start acting guilty even when you're not. You speed up tests, change routes, swap codes, and each change can be read as preparation. Fear becomes a language. Worse still, that fear doesn't stay in Moscow. Aligned states, allies, even neutral countries begin to feel the game is too big. Some want American protection. Others want distance. And trust, the cement of alliances, starts to crack. At that point, the world is no longer divided only by ideology. It's divided by access to the technology to see, hear, and anticipate. And that's what makes our central question even richer. When did they realize the U.S. could see everything? It wasn't one day. It was a chain of small humiliations, each one more inevitable. And when they finally accepted it, the coldest decision followed. If we can't stop them from seeing, we'll make them see what we want. The next chapter is exactly that. The performances that almost fooled the world, and the ones that failed in embarrassing fashion. They start staging spectacles for the sky. Calculated movements, photogenic construction, convoys timed to be captured on schedule. The goal is simple: feed the lens a story. If Americans interpret images, then images can be silent propaganda. One complex is reorganized to look stronger than it is. Elsewhere, they do the opposite: hide real capability and display scrap. And for a while, it works. Analysts on the other side debate photos like theologians reading signs. Is this new? Is this bait? Is it real or set dressing? But the sky is patient. A performance holds for a day, maybe a week, but a satellite comes back and comes back again. And when it returns, it catches the mistake. A tarp placed too late. A truck that disappears without explanation. A structure that grows too quickly. Truth shows up in repetition. And that's when many Soviet officers grasp something cruel. American technology isn't only about seeing, it's about comparing. The weapon isn't the camera, it's time. Time turned into evidence. And when time becomes evidence, secrecy becomes a deadline. In that climate, every major project turns into a race against the next satellite pass. Imagine building something while thinking, how many minutes until they see it? That rewires an entire government's brain. And if you're over 50, you might remember that feeling that the world was always hanging by a thread. It wasn't movie drama. It was a global nervous system. Before we go further, tell me in the comments, should governments have this kind of power to observe, or does it inevitably create paranoia and risk? And hit like and subscribe, because the next part ties it together. Why seeing everything didn't bring instant peace. It brought a more sophisticated fear. At the peak of the game, the irony becomes clear. The more the US can see, the more dangerous the world feels. Because seeing doesn't solve the core problem, interpretation does. And in the Cold War, interpretation is always filtered through suspicion. An expanded base could be defense or attack preparation. A military exercise could be routine or cover. A moved missile could be maintenance or threat. The sky delivers data, but data doesn't deliver intent. And that's when the Soviets feel the deeper blow. The Americans don't need to guess intent. They only need to build scenarios where any Soviet intent looks aggressive. The Soviets respond the same way. The result is a dance where both sides swear they are reacting, never provoking. But exposure makes the dance more jittery. Everyone moves too fast, talks too hard, because they believe the other side already knows too much. Still, there's an unexpected twist. Sometimes this ability to see prevents escalation. If one side can confirm the other isn't mobilizing for an attack, the fever can drop. But that requires trust, and trust is exactly what's missing. So seeing everything becomes both brake and accelerator. Brake when it confirms calm, accelerator when it seems to confirm threat. And the Soviet officers who once opened an envelope of impossible photos realize they've entered a world where absolute secrecy no longer exists. The question now is, how do you survive in a world without secrecy? And the answer is simple and dark. You survive by managing narratives, alliances, and above all, fear. Because fear, unlike satellites, crosses every border. And finally, the title makes its sharpest sense. The day they realized wasn't a cinematic instant. It was the moment the idea settled in the gut. The US wasn't only competing, it was monitoring, cataloging, reducing uncertainty. And when a country reduces uncertainty, it increases power without firing. For the Soviets, that marked a change of era. Before, secrecy was a wall. After, secrecy became smoke. An older officer, shaped by World War II, might have put it like this. We used to hide troops. Now we try to hide intention. And hiding intention is harder, because intention leaks in details. The pace of construction, the frequency of tests, shift changes, urgency. American technology turned small signals into strategic reading, and that scared them because it stripped away the last psychological advantage, surprise. Without surprise, you need constant strength, and constant strength costs. It costs money, people, rest, stability. It costs decades. That's how the Cold War becomes less a battle and more a grind. Two men staring without blinking, waiting for the other to tire first. If you're still with me, comment. What's more frightening? Technology that explodes or technology that watches? And subscribe, because stories like this aren't only about the past. They're a quiet warning about the present. Because one conclusion survives every decade. The moment you accept you're being watched, you change who you are. Governments change, armies change, and societies, without noticing, change too. Fear of exposure creates self-censorship, rigidity, overreaction. And that applies to countries, but also to people. In the Cold War, the Soviets responded with camouflage, staging, hardening. The Americans responded with more technology, more satellites, more analysis. And both told themselves it was defense. But the line between defense and control is thin when the sky becomes a camera. What started with an aircraft flying too high ends with the feeling that the entire planet is sitting in a glass display case. If you're over 50, you might remember the atmosphere, the news maps, the arrows, the numbers, and a fear with no face. That fear had a lens. And what made it even more unsettling was knowing the lens wasn't tired, wasn't sleepy, wasn't guilty. It simply recorded. And when something records, someone decides. So the final question isn't, how did they realize the US could see everything? The question is, what do you do once you realize someone can see everything? Do you harden? Negotiate? Pretend? Adapt? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read the best ones and I can turn them into future episodes. Hit like if this narrative grabbed you, subscribe so you don't miss the next Cold War backroom stories, and tell me which country you want next: China, Cuba, East Germany, or another one you believe trembled when it felt the reach of American technology.